All right. Good evening, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us tonight for the Alumni Office Free Food for the Mind series. Tonight, we are very lucky to have one of our own, Marcus Du Bois Watson from the class of 1995. But before we get into it, just want to say hello. Thank you to our alums. Thank you to staff members. Thank you to friends of the college who are joining us here this evening. And as we said, this is the final series for our fall series of Free Food for the Mind, and we will be looking to do some other ones in the spring semester as well. And also want a special shout out to Marcus from President Heidi McPherson. She was sorry she couldn't be here this evening. She was at the YWCA board meeting, but she really appreciates you doing this. And Marcus is also a member of our foundation board here at the college. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to him. But before we get started, just a brief little introduction. Marcus is the assistant professor at SUNY Buffalo State College. We'd love to have him at Brockport, but he's at SUNY Buffalo State College just down the road, is a foundation board member. And tonight he's going to share with us and help us understand the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement and the related push to include more education in the field of African and Afro-American studies in education, corporate, and other settings. We have somebody who's on, we'd like everybody to mute here. I can mute some other folks. And with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to Marcus. Marcus, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I appreciate it. Thank you, Brockport, for having me. I'd in particular like to thank Mike Andriach, a good friend, colleague of mine, for having me. I got to shout out my beautiful mother. She just left the screen. Kramer, Dr. Getz, and Ann Getz. I love y'all. My mother and father from a different, however you say it. I love y'all. It's so great to see. I don't know if Mark Shamel is on here, but if he is, greetings to him as well. And thank you everyone for attending. A little bit about me, a little bit more about me. Just because I want you to have a sense of my standpoint, my perspective, how I'm situated as I'm presenting certain kinds of material today. One thing that's important to know about me as I'm speaking is that I grew up Black in America. Okay, so that's a basic thing, and all that means in terms of growing up, being made to feel other. Sometimes it's a romanticized sort of other, like you're a great jock and athlete and all those kinds of things. Other times it's negatively othered, stereotyped, followed around malls, stopped by police and so forth. But growing up Black in America is one thing that forms what I'm going to say and how I speak. I have spent many years on the African continent as a Peace Corps volunteer and doing research for anthropology and also for social reasons. Okay, I'm married to a Ghanaian in West Africa. That experience has influenced my perspective, my standpoint. I have, I would say, expertise in cultural anthropology and in culture in general. So I come from a cultural kind of perspective. It's not that I bracket away politics or economics and so forth, but my training is in culture. For simplicity purposes, for me, culture, it provides a general design for living and a pattern for Africana studies. I am on the editorial board for the Journal of Black Psychology. And overall, I am motivated to get humanity out of its own way so that we can make real progress. And I happen to do so through mostly a focus on liberation for African and African descended people, but always with an inclusiveness to that. So as I get started, I'm curious about you. There's too many people to have you speak sort of individually, but I'm curious what sectors you come from, what your professions are, So maybe if one person says something and you're from that same profession, you don't have to say so. But I'm sort of curious, who am I speaking to? If you wouldn't mind sharing, who are you? Are you in education? Are you in business?
Hey, Marcus, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's Mark Schammel.
Hey, Mark, how you doing, my man, my brother? Still blocking
How
for
are
me.
you, buddy?
Good. Still blocking for me.
Always blocking for you, man. Always. I don't know. I could make it a full 100 yards down the field, but I'll always block for you. So I'm obviously, for those who don't know, Marcus and I were teammates together at Brockport for 4 years and roomed together on the road, and a close friend for, gosh, too long to know. And I've spent the last 25 years of my life as a criminal defense lawyer. So I'm also an assistant, or I guess not assistant, I'm an adjunct professor at the George Washington School of Law. And so I am been living the issues of radical need for criminal justice reform as it reflects on the needs of the Black community, which is I was on a call today. I'm a member of the ABA task force today that's trying to put together something to change what we're doing for diversion and trying to deal with the issues that are facing Black America as being incarcerated at 6 times the rate while it's only 1/6 of the population. And so I'm out there every day dealing with this, both as a defense attorney and as a part-time educator.
Thank you very much. So we have lawyer, criminal defense, other folks I'm speaking to in terms of your backgrounds, professions.
Marcus, my name's Bob Tamby. I actually work in the corporate world, and we actually just recently had I believe it was 21 days of inclusion and diversity. And so we were sent emails daily for links to many videos to go over that, as well as the invitation to join a lot of many seminars that have recently taken place as well. And it was very, very eye-opening, to say the least. I'm glad the company was a part of that and did that. And I'd definitely be happy if we did that, every so often.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much.
How you doing, Marcus? You and Mark were freshmen, and I was a student coach. This is Troy Purley.
Oh man.
We go Coach Getz. Coach Getz was one of my coaches, but I wasn't a tight end. I was a running back. And I run a chocolate company out of Washington, D.C. I'm a general manager. The name of the company is Divine Chocolate, and we source from Ghana. So I go to Ghana, annually, and we're a social enterprise. So the work environment is consciously diverse. And basically, I when I saw the email, I said, wow, these guys are old men like me. So I wanted to see y'all guys. I was really interested in the subject matter, working and heading up a social enterprise. And hey, Coach Getz, it's good to see your face.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have a lawyer, corporate world in different ways, chief diversity officer I saw here, professor of English. Are we frozen? Are we still here?
You're back, Marcus. You just froze for a second, but you're good.
All right. So so it's good to if I missed anyone, sorry, but it's good to get a feel for who we might be in terms of our standpoints, at least professionally. Chief diversity officer, higher education, English professor, corporate world in a variety of ways, lawyers, and so forth. All right, so I want to proceed in the following manner. I'm going to introduce the topic, hopefully briefly. Then I wanted to do something creative. So Carrie is going to intermittently put up a slide for all of us to see. And the slide has 7 or so terms on it. And I would like for audience members, you guys, friends, family, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, from an African-centered point of view that I'm coming from, to just basically choose a term that looks interesting to you, or maybe if we're slightly more sophisticated, one that you think we should discuss first. All of us, we're at a tipping point in our country's history and really in world history. We have a real chance, I think, to exorcise demons that have haunted our country, the world, and basic human relationships for centuries. I think we have an opportunity to make the world look totally different going forward than it did even a year ago, right? Before Breonna Taylor, before George Floyd, and many others. I think we can make housing, education, healthcare, criminal justice, everything look different, fairer, better, finally. I think we have a window of opportunity. We have a chance. I would suggest, and I think I'm with folks who would agree with me, that in order to make this transformational change, we must be intentional. We're understanding it's no longer good enough to just not be racist. We must be intentionally anti-racist. At the very least, intentional about what the problems are, intentional about how we are complicit in them, and intentional about being or embracing being uncomfortable. I would say that the comfort that some of us and some of our ancestors have been enjoying for many years has been borrowed from and constituted by great distortions in human equality and fairness. So what I want to focus on today is being intentional about two things. Two big pieces of the puzzle, I would say. Being intentional about getting a better understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement, especially with a historical cultural focus, understanding the long context for it, and being intentional about raising our awareness of what Africana Studies is and how it should be a key to creating this transformational change that I think we're all looking for. Africana Studies has also been called Black Studies. It's been called African American Studies. It's been called Africology. It goes by different names. I'll say Africana Studies, and I might sometimes say Black Studies. At a minimum, and I will sometimes refer to notes when it's a peculiar kind of detail or I want to get some of these ideas out there the way I've written them down. At a minimum, I hope that we all leave here empowered along the following lines. I hope that we reflexively acknowledge that many of us most likely have very little understanding of what Africana Studies is. I hope we acknowledge the importance of Africana Studies for creating this fairer world that many of us wish to see. By the time we're done, I hope we understand why the terms Black and white are relevant and important. I hope we have a much stronger sense of what institutional racism is and how it manifests itself. Mm-hmm. And the last two things, I hope we leave becoming much more intolerant and incensed by phrases such as all lives matter. Again, I would think that many of us are there already. And I hope that we become intolerant and incensed when people ask things like, well, what did so-and-so do? You know, in parentheses, to deserve being shot, killed, and so forth. What did the person do? You know, A recurring theme in what we'll talk about is agency reduction formation. Agency reduction formation. This is a concept out of Black studies associated with the work of Michael Tilliston. Agency reduction formation. This is the idea that it's empirical reality, not just an idea, the empirical reality in which Black assertions of agency, historically and now, are quashed, splintered, diffused, undermined, and derailed every time that Black agency tries to rear its head, historically and now. So that will be a recurring theme. All right, so that said, if Carrie would put up the list of terms, please. I think by discussing these terms, we can get to some of the objectives, the two objectives, a better understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement, especially from a historical cultural perspective on the one hand, and on the other hand, the importance of Africana studies. So what I would ask us to do, are there any audience members who just find one of these terms interesting, or maybe which one do you think would come first if we were going to make it a sort of linear talk?
So Dr. Watson, I'm not going to impinge on your very powerful engagement here, but one thing it might be as a preliminary is to make briefly a breakdown of Blackness and whiteness in some kind of ways as a framing of this, because I don't know where everyone is situated in terms of understanding those racial concepts and their structural function.
Sure. That's a good question. And I think we can get to that through one of those terms, so that we're doing two things at once. So let me, well, one of the terms was white studies. Let's start there. And then Dr. King, I think we can get to that question through this, okay? White studies. That probably sounds funny, right, to many of us, white studies. The context for this concept is Black studies, right? And I don't know if we know the history of Africana Black studies, but it comes about through grassroots student and community demands for it in the 1960s, right? San Francisco State College, 1969, the first Department of Africana Studies in the country. So people sometimes ask, why Black studies? Why we're trying to get past the racial problems, and aren't we going back into it by talking about Black and white and so forth? And what those people
are you doing that, or is he
are not understanding is that we do in fact have white studies in this sense. The academic in me wants to say most, but it probably is all. But I'll say most traditional disciplines, departments, academic fields of study are Eurocentric, right? They're conceived by, they make sense to, and they benefit, even without them knowing, whites, okay, historically. So this is easy to find. I looked up some, I'm going to refer to my notes here. So let's take fashion, for example. When you look up the history of fashion, you're going to go to Renaissance Europe. You're going to go to Elizabethan trends of the 1700s. If you go to sociology history, Plato, Aristotle, Auguste Comte, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, and so forth. Sociology, did I say biology? Renaissance Europe, Vesalius, Harvey, Linnaeus, Buffon, and so forth. Chemistry, George Agricola, Sir Francis Bacon and the scientific method. Robert Boyle, and so forth. Philosophy of law, Thomas, did I freeze? Okay.
No.
Philosophy of law, Thomas Aquinas, natural law, Italian. John Austin, Jeremy Bentham, British, legal positivism, and so forth. So what Africana studies understand, Dr. Getz, you have a question?
Marcus?
Yeah, is Carrie getting people? Yes.
White studies was also mainly male studies. And white studies tended to say very little about the oppression of the slave. It said very little about crimes against Native Americans. It generally expressed the concept of the U.S. as city on the hill, and God knows we weren't that either.
Very true, very true. Thank you. Yes. So that's even more nuanced, right? So straight, white, male, wealthy, you can throw all of those things in there, right? Class, gender, and so forth. So what Africana studies helps us to see, and the reason the people who created it felt they needed to create it was that if you just go through your typical undergraduate or graduate college experience, students are implicitly required to almost major or to understand or gain expertise in Eurocentric forms of knowledge, right, and understanding and so forth, right? So there is from an African-centered studies perspective, there is white studies. It goes without saying because it comes without saying, right? So, in a lot of colleges, they talk about why should we require students to take a course in African-American studies, for example, right? And again, from that perspective that I just laid out, asking that question at best is historically naive, culturally naive about what's actually happening around us in the education system. At worst, it's aiding and abetting a white supremacist, European-centered agenda, right? By saying everyone, no matter what your background is, you're gonna come out of these 4 years with an understanding of Eurocentric ways of understanding what Eurocentric knowledge looks like, and so forth, right? But African-centered studies is optional or mergeable, right? So, we understand that Africana studies is the home of Black intellectual thought. If people in the street are protesting Black Lives Matter, the academic corollary is that Black intellectual life is supposed to matter, right? And supposed to be valued, right? But what we find at most colleges and universities is that students are implicitly required to gain understanding in Eurocentric forms of knowledge, and it's optional, right? Whether or not they take courses in Africana studies. We can ask straightforwardly, if I teach an education, the education department, are my students required to take Introduction to Africana Studies? Right? We could. So again, this is a way of gaining even more nuanced understanding of institutional racism. Because if the answer is no, then my students are skating through with a degree in education, ready to go out into the workforce, right? Without having not only had to take a course in Africana studies, but not having to think that that was valuable enough, right? That they should have gotten off at that off ramp, checked out what was going on, so that can inform them when they're teaching, whoever they're teaching. Dr. King, I'm not sure if that totally answers your question.
So somewhat, again, so, you know, through bad life choices, I don't teach anymore. So you will definitely be up on the scholarship more than I am, but the interplay between the concept of race and racism and how blackness and whiteness function, right?
Sorry, you froze.
Oh,
the last thing
sorry.
I heard was you're up on the scholarship more than I am.
No, you're up on the scholarship more
Right.
than I am, because I'm an administrator now and I don't teach as much and I don't really have time for scholarship as much as I would like to. But the relationship between race, racism, and how that plays out with black and whiteness, right? You hit on some of the ways in which in education and other ways, whiteness is normalized as a way of being in the world, right? But people can come to a view that there were these races, and then racism came around as people started to fight for power or resources or things like this. And that may not, at least in my view, be the accurate story of how race and racism were constructed, right? There was marginalization, and then to justify, in particular, the enslavement, the marginalization of Black and brown bodies, the concept of race came. So race is the child of racism, not vice versa. And what that plays out is that the things that we see in blackness and whiteness in America in particular are in that lineage, okay?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think if we put that chart back up there, I think what I'm going to do is go to another concept that helps flesh that out a little bit, what you're saying, Dr. King. Let's go to 1669 Virginia Act. Again, I want as we do this, this is all an Africana studies perspective on these issues, okay? So I want us to be able to reflexively say, do I know this? Have I heard of this? You know, how well informed from an Africana studies perspective am I? Okay, that's a rhetorical, reflexive question. All right, so 1669 Virginia Act, also called. How many of us have heard of this? Okay, a couple, three. Okay, also called the casual killings of slaves. Okay, an act about the casual killings of slaves. All right, so you can hear in the title of that, the act, an act about the casual killings of slaves, 1669, that slavery it already made that transition, right, in terms of Blacks being indentured servants for a couple of decades, along with whites, to slavery, Black equals slave. All right, that transition had been made at this point. And now you have laws that are concretizing that, making it tighter and tighter. This is one of them. The context is, this is a plantation economy, right, in Virginia at this time. We know this part of it, tobacco and so forth. And the reason the enslavers are making money and increasing their wealth hand over foot is because the cost of labor is free when it comes to enslaved Black people, and it's nearly free when it comes to white indentured servants who are working next to them. Okay, so this is the context. Now, if you are a white enslaver at this time, a European enslaver, you like your situation, we might think, right? This is really good stuff. But in order to keep it going, you need a servile workforce, right? A pliant workforce. And of course, people don't want to work uncompensated and abused, and people don't want to work for almost nothing. So what did they do? Everybody, they would run away, or they would stop working, and so forth. When it came to the white indentured servants, if the white planters thought they were working slowly or skipping days or running away, they could punish them by adding time to their service. When it came to enslaved Black people, they were enslaved for life. So adding time was not a punishment. What whites had been finding, this is the slave master, the mistress, and overseers. The act explicitly names all of them. Okay, they would sometimes try to beat the enslaved Africans so much that they would kill them, and they didn't want to be. It said any
Hey,
one of those.
Marcus, you froze. Marcus, you froze there for a second.
Okay.
Right after you said, I'm blanking what you said. Just repeat that last sentence.
Okay, so any one of those categories of people, white slave master male, white slave mistress, and overseer. But because of this act, they would not be charged criminally if they happen to kill, murder an enslaved Black person when they're trying to discipline them to work. All right. So this was one of those original get away with killing Black people for free types of acts, right? That jump started much of the culture that we see today. So we get a lot of things from analyzing this act. Okay, one is that, and we have to understand this about the act. The rationale was, since enslaved people are property, there's no such thing as having malice toward your property, and so it cannot be murder. Right? You can't murder your property. That's how they were thinking about it, okay? And that's how they were arguing it. So, so what this establishes even more, Black people equal slave, Black people equal property, non-entity, and so forth. A kind of being that can be killed for free, so to speak, right? Without repercussions when it's whites who are doing this, right? So we're embedding this mentality into our culture, into our laws, and laws like this spread from Virginia around. Okay, and of course, slavery was all over the Americas, not just the South, during this time period. But there's more nuance to this. By looking at this particular act, we can see another feature that has become normalized within our culture, which is Black people, number one, have a place. Number two, they must stay in their place. Right? Number three, they shouldn't even bat an eyelash or lift a finger to try to combat that. You cannot resist, right? So what this act really did was say, you cannot even resist being enslaved, or you can be murdered, right? For quote unquote free. On top of that, but by looking through this act, we can start to see what we might call white pathology, what Africana studies would call white pathology coming into existence here, right? A kind of diseased way of thinking about what you were saying, Dr. King, race and racism and skin color and surface appearance and forgetting about the eternal spirit and so forth, right? We can start seeing that come into play here because look at what whiteness means here through this act. It means because of the color of my skin, and as Dr. Getz said, probably also my ability to own land, property, and so forth, wealth. I am white, and I can treat people with darker hues this way, and I am absolved from being treated that way. Okay, and so what whiteness as an identity, as an existential identity, develops in this context of I am white because you stay in your place, and any kind of transgression of that, it feels like a threat to me, to my being, to the way I've been socialized to be. All right, so we can see that theme of agency reduction here, right? So the agency at play was enslaved people, apparently in that context, wanting to resist, right? Either by stopping to work or running away. And that agency reduction formation comes into play with in the form of this law, right? That says, if you so much as move a finger out of place, you can be murdered, right? And for quote unquote for free. Anybody see anything else they would like for me to talk about? Otherwise, I can just jump to another one.
Marcus, I don't know if you can hear me. This is Mark again.
Yes.
Could you talk about white rage? I think that particularly in light of some of the comments you talked about, some of the pushback, and you mentioned one that always sort of gets my goat, the All Lives Matter movement, which I imagine ties in a little bit to white rage. I'd like to hear a little bit.
Sure, thank you. It's also cultural appropriation yet again, right? It's Black people and their allies who came up with Black Lives Matter, and then you get people, who say all lives matter. So that they're piggybacking off of that. So that might be considered a kind of strange cultural appropriation. But in terms of white rage, we know Carol Anderson, writes that book, White Rage, and and what she means by it is, again, anytime historically, empirically, she's finding anytime Blacks try to assert agency, there is a white rage response to it. Okay, I would say this about it. There are two elemental features of white rage. One is white nationalism. We're not used to thinking about this term. We might hear Black nationalism sometimes, but white nationalism is a real thing. Okay, so again, by nationalism, meaning that we are going to bond together as a group based on whiteness. All right, that's again going back to that 1669 act, right? If that act is presuming, right, the formation of whiteness, right? That there's a white community, a white group of people who should be absolved from being charged criminally with doing certain things against these other kind of people who are from some other nation. All right, so that's an example of white nationalism. Enslavement itself, right? Who does the enslaving, right? And who gets enslaved? Those who are able to do the enslaving, right, is defined in terms of whiteness. So white nationalism has been practiced for a long time in our history. Segregation, of course, the era of segregation, 1896 to 1954, that's white nationalism. That is, we are establishing white schools. You cannot enter. Labor unions are for whites only. You cannot enter. White women are for white men only. You cannot marry them. The suburbs, 1950s, for whites, that you cannot enter, or unless you want a cop following you, right? So these are all practical examples of how white nationalism is a real thing and how it works. The second element of white rage is white supremacy. Right, so the assumption behind all of that white nationalism is the superiority of people of European descent, right? It's you cannot come here, you cannot marry this person, you have to be in that subordinate situation. So white nationalism, white supremacy. Now, once you have white nationalism and white supremacy, then you can have white rage, because then you can, now you have something to be angry at whenever the walls, the borders of that white nation are felt to be disrupted, to be overcome, to be threatened, right? Now you can say, no, I'm angry. I see you, Dr. Getz. Let me get through these few examples. 1865, Do we know
Always
what
say
happened in
you don't have to keep
1865?
with me.
13th Amendment. People of African descent are free. We also have white rage in the very same year. The KKK is born 1865. Okay, that's a historic example, right? Of you have an assertion of Black agency and you have white rage as a response. 1954, May. You have something great for Black people, and I would say if it's great for everyone. Brown versus Board, May 1954, right? Black people are starting to get a little bit excited. You know, we're breaking this thing down. What comes into being in July 1954? The White Citizens Council, specifically because of that desegregation decision. Okay, and you know, historians think the White Citizens Council is responsible for that tragic, terrible murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi. You have the election of President Obama, first Black president. You have the Black Lives Matter movement starting up in 2013. And what do you have coming right on the other side of it? The alt-right, right? The alt-right movement. Richard Spencer, 2010. You have 2017, Charlottesville, right? So white rage. Again, that theme of agency reduction, right? In cases where historically, where Blacks, including in the Black Lives Matter movement, trying to assert some kind of unity, some kind of call and cry to be understood as humans, as equal and as good and valuable as everyone else. White rage is a phenomenon, right? That comes into being. We can move on to another concept.
Got a question from Dr. Getz, Marcus.
Yes, Dr. Getz.
You know, I think that an additional factor that really exacerbates white rage these days is the realization on the part of people who are very active in white rage that by 2050, whites will almost certainly be a minority in this country.
Right, that's got to stink.
Certainly scares the hell out of them.
Right, if you're socialized into that mold, you know, of the way life is supposed to work is that there's supposed to be, you know, a kind of supremacy or a worldwide nod in recognition of the supremacy of European structures and cultures and ideologies and history and so forth. If you're socialized into that mold, even subconsciously, right, it probably stings, right, to hear that, which you just said, Dr. Getz, that by 2050, the majority of the U.S. population will be people of color.
Can I ask a question? Just in the the list of terms, there's no reference to the Black Panthers in the 1960s, and I'm wondering how you see that.
I mean, this is just a few terms. I could have chosen dozens.
Okay.
Right, I could have chosen dozens. Again, I chose terms that came to my mind as sort of the quickest way to try to achieve those two objectives that I started out with. So I want to speak from these to those objectives, right? A better historical understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement, especially that it's just the latest iteration, you know, of a greater movement for Black lives. I think, yeah, movement for Black lives is there. And then also the importance of the Africana studies perspective, which we're hearing it as we're presenting here, as we're talking.
Great.
Carrie, did we want to?
Jackie, did you have your hand up? Were you raising your hand? No, you want me to put it back up, Marcus, or do people have
Yeah, and yeah, that's fine.
Oh, someone said the doll experiment in the chat, Marcus.
So someone said what?
The doll experiment.
Oh, doll experiment. Okay. Again, this is an example again of the power of Africana studies to disrupt the mainstream narrative, right? We talk about changing the narrative, you have to change the narrator if you want to change the narrative, right? So Africana studies is an example of an alternative narrator, right? That helps us see things differently. So the doll experiment, we know about the doll experiment, I think, right? 1940s, the husband-wife Clark team, and those experiments were instrumental in helping to bring about the Brown versus Board decision. Okay, so I think we know that much. But here's what I wanted to say about it. This is kind of anecdotal. I have a very good friend from Ghana who is studying here where I'm at in Buffalo. And he has 2 children, 2 girls. One is 12, one is 5. And I took them to a store one day and we passed dolls. And I asked them, which doll would you want? You probably know where this is gonna go. They're little black girls, okay? Which doll do you want? They pointed to the white doll. I said, which doll looks like you? Because I know those experiments, right? And they pointed to the black one. I said, which doll is beautiful? They point to the white doll. Okay. So of course I'm asking myself, is this the 1940s or is it 2020, right? And so, you know, the mainstream narrative has many elements to it, but one is the idea of perpetual progress. This idea that we're just marching, right? And things are changing and things are getting better. And especially at a fundamental level, you know, people will say, well, things aren't as bad as they were before. And of course, you know, for some surface level sorts of things, that's true. There's been a space created for a certain number of middle class blacks to occupy middle class professions. And I think many of us in those professions kind of like the extra elbow room, you know, and so forth, right? But for, you know, from a Black studies perspective, you know, we would call that, you know, something like conceptual incarceration. You know, this idea that, you know, just because some very few of us have been able to make it to the middle class, right, that we sort of forget that structurally things are similar. And so Africana studies helps us understand even how we should conceptualize time. Right, from an Africana studies perspective, this is still the 1940s. We're in the same era, the same epic, and Africana studies is not fooled by numbers on a timeline that tell us it's a new decade, it's a new decade, it's a new decade, and that sort of subconsciously makes us feel like we're going somewhere in a straight line, right? Whereas in reality, at least from an Africana studies perspective, right, we're part of the same colonial, from one person, you know, one colonial culture, you know, from a mainstream perspective, a democratic culture, we might say, but from a Black study, we're in the same colonial culture at its roots that we were in the 1940s, right? And so it helps us to challenge some of those mainstream ideas that make us think inaccurately, frankly, about where we are, what the progress we're making, and where we're going. So that's why that was there. That was more of a quote unquote light one or fun.
Marcus, not sure if you saw in the chat, but just a comment from Jitwan, bad at any degree is bad. Until there is equity, it is all bad.
I beautiful name, Jitwan. I agree, 100%. All right, should we move to another one?
Yeah, it's 5:52, Marcus. So if you want to move to another one, I can put it back up, or if people have questions too, either way.
I'm happy to stay on. So if folks have to go, I understand. We talked about 1669 Virginia Act. We talked about white rage, white studies, Dahl experiment. Should we try to get one or two more in? Anybody interested in hearing about any of these things?
I thought I heard someone starting to say something there. I couldn't see the chat, so I'll put it back up.
All right, I can just go.
Okay, go for it.
All right. Let's go with Tennessee versus Garner.
Mm-hmm.
Folks hear about that one? Has anyone heard of this one? All right, Tennessee versus Garner. 1985. Basically, this case, Supreme Court case, it makes it legal for police officers to kill anybody, although the case involved a Black person, and not be held responsible. It involved an event back in 1974. I won't go too deep into the event because I think that takes time. But a little boy running away from the police, and white male police officer shoots him in the back while fleeing. And the case basically said that it was actually applauded at the time for how progressive it was. There was a lot of language in it about the police should not use excessive force. They were relying on an 1858 Tennessee slave law, okay, to do this kind of action of running away and shooting. Right? It was a way that they would capture runaway slaves. Right? So they were saying it's outdated. It sounded really good, but right in the middle of it, according to my understanding, there was a poison pill that just kind of ruined it all from an Africana perspective. Okay, so the case said if the officer believes that the fleeing subject can cause harm to them or to anyone they might be passing, then it's okay to shoot, to kill. This Tennessee versus Garner is brought up in almost all of the Black Lives Matter cases of police killings against Blacks too. And so when we hear about police officers getting out of these things, it goes back to this. It also goes back to a related case called Graham versus Connor, 1989. Graham versus Connor, 1989. So this case says police officers cannot be held responsible for the truth of the matter, the truth of the event, right? So when you had DeThorne Graham, a Black guy, and his friend stopping at a gas station because Graham was diabetic, and he was having a low blood sugar sort of attack. And he's going in there to get some orange juice, and he's feeling all wheezy. And he grabs the orange juice. He sees there's a long line. He puts the orange juice on the shelf. He runs out to the car and says, "Take me home." And the police stopped them on the way and said, thinking they robbed the gasoline station. And they plead with the police. My friend is a diabetic. He was just going there to get orange juice, and so on and so forth. The police officers didn't believe that. They they abused Graham, knocking him unconscious, throwing him on the hood of the car while unconscious, dropping him unconscious onto the front yard of his apartment, where he wakes up the next day. When they go back to the gasoline station, there's the orange juice on the counter. There's the store owners. No one robbed us, right? So Graham versus Connor says the only thing that matters is what the police officers perceive to be true, and they cannot be held responsible for what the actual truth was. This case, that case, like Tennessee versus Garner, is brought up in the Michael Brown case, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and others. So that's why that's there. How we doing? Right. All right, so Jiton Dill says those cases mimic slave patrol paradigm. So slave patrol was up there too. Many of us probably know this, that modern day policing has its origins in slave patrols. Right, I'm assuming many of us have heard this, okay? So 1704, South Carolina is sort of established as the inauguration of these slave patrols. Again, the context is plantation slavery, right? The economy is based on the exploitation, abuse, humiliation of Africans, people of African descent. And so for this economy to work, I need pliant, submissive human beings to do this work and do it like I say and when I say, and don't try to resist, finger out a place, all of that. We established that, okay? Now, of course, people don't like being treated that way. So running away, should have been predictable then, and surely in hindsight, it's understandable to us. So you have enslaved people running away. And what the plantation owners did in the full legality of the state, of the colonies, was to create slave patrols, where their job was a group of white men. There's Dr. Getz's point again, a group of white men who their job was to stop Black people they saw. They can ask for their badges. In those days, you needed a badge to travel from your plantation to somewhere else. And it had your name and your owner and what your profession, like what you did and so forth. So they could stop and ask for that. They could search your belongings. Because again, if you're walking property, so to speak, you are a belonging. So you don't have rights, what to be searched or not searched, right? So anything you have can be searched. And then finally, those slave patrols terrorized Africans, right? As another tool for making human beings submissive and compliant. So we know that policing as we know it starts in the mid 1800s. But we see here again that policing has a history, policing has a culture, right? And the cultural elements they're clear right now as we look at it, but we can see the origins of it, right? Policing as slave patrols has to do with controlling Black and brown populations, okay? It also has to do with keeping Black and brown populations in their place. It has to do with preventing resistance, back in those days in the form of running away, right? And so when we understand culture, like an anthropologist, when we understand culture, then we understand culture perseveres. And this is how you can have this crazy phenomenon where you have good police officers who go home and hug their wives and husbands, or whoever they're married to. They play with their kids, they pet their dogs, they say hi to their neighbors. Good people, really, and people who, even if you and I are in that situation, and someone like Jacob Blake, I'm telling him, stop, stop, stop. And he's walking around to his car, and I don't know what he's doing there or what he's getting. Any one of us might be fearful because he's not listening, and any one of us might pull a trigger or do something to try to prevent me from going home safely. Right. So anyway, good. It's this situation where you can have those good people who, when they walk into work, when they're trained into the profession, they're trained into a culture that has a history and has principles, right? That they then become, probably maybe in some of their own minds, paradoxically situated within, right? Where they talk about bad cops, but the good ones don't call them out, right? So that's slave patrols. Dogs is an interesting thing there too. Part of the slave patrols was those folks would use dogs to chase down runaways, right? So when we see the 1960s and we see those images, those videos of the dogs being sicked on peaceful Black protesters, right? Those dogs themselves, in the way they're being used, right, is an echo from history, right? A culture of the relationship between dogs, white use of dogs, and keeping Black people in their place, right?
Marcus, we had a question from Irene. She was wondering about some recommended readings around these topics, or some that you would recommend. I know you've mentioned a few, but
let me type some up here into the chat before we go, if that's okay. I mean, for sure, what I would do is, well, you're not students. I was going to say take Black Studies courses, but this is where all this discussion, this enlightenment, this perspective is being had. But I'll Achille Mbembe's latest book, I want to say 2012, is a must read. But so he talks about, it's called Black Reason. Black Reason. It's a tough read though. It's very philosophical. But he makes the point that there is a movement for Black lives, not just the Black lives. No problem. Thanks, Dr. King. There is a much longer movement for Black lives that started the very first time a slave ship captured and transported enslaved Africans to the Americas, right? And we know they were transported there to be a mass free labor force, to jumpstart what we call the modern world into existence, right? And he makes the point that, first of all, as soon as we get to that point where Black equals slave, Black equals property, Black equals non-entity, right? As soon as we get to that point, we then are full head of steam in Blacks being the raw material for the creation of the modern world, the poisoned soil out of which so many other kinds of discrimination, right, grew. And we're still trying to work on that to this day, right? So ever since those founding moments of the modern world, the slave trade, the transforming free human beings into the raw material for the making of the modern world, ever since that point, you have a movement for Black lives, whether it's the resistance that we hear through that 1669 Virginia Act, right, where they're trying, there are enslaved people who trying to resist, right? We have it in the slave revolts, the Stono Rebellion, 1739, the New York City Conspiracy, 1741, Gabriel's Conspiracy, 1800, Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831, the multiracial abolitionist movement, late 1700s into the 1800s, the Niagara movement, right, started right here in Western New York, NAACP, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, and so on and so forth. So the Black Lives Matter movement is just the latest iteration of a long movement for Black lives that started at the very beginning, the origins, right, of the modern world and of what we now call the United States.
Marcus, rather than you have to, it was a great question. We can get folks, if you want to put together a list, we can email it out to folks, give you some more time to think about it and get it together. But another question did come in too. What are some ways or some things you suggest that we do to continue our quest to become anti-racist? That's
my question for you. Seriously, that's how I was ending this. I was going to say, based on what you've heard, first of all, did you hear anything that inspired any new thoughts or perspectives? And if so, are there ways within those professions and fields that you said you were in that you could think about being intentional, right? In terms of being anti-racist. So if you don't mind, if I can take back my question and see, you know, explore your intelligence and smarts and help me out.
It's your show. You could do that. So
Thank you.
Questions out there, folks. You can unmute yourself, or if you prefer to type in the chat.
But anybody, that question was for all of us.
Yeah, I was opening up to all of us. I knew it wasn't just fired back at me.
Oh, okay. No, right. So
you have to, you have to call out people who express racist ideas or comments. You can't just listen to somebody's stupid joke or comment and let it pass. If you're going to be anti-racist, you have to do it in an active fashion.
Great. That's great. Apologize for past transgressions. Okay, so Irene says apologize is another one. Apologize to who? If I can ask, like, or do you mean just go through life with an apologetic kind of mindset and heart that might manifest beautifully, you know, as you interact with different people? Not sure.
Do you want you to say?
This is Donnie. What I really enjoyed about the discussion and everything that you really mapped out the past, right, to where we are today. Like, how did we get to where we are today? And what I find interesting, now know what the solution is to this, is when you look at just social media, how people are consuming information and how people just, I think, just human behavior, people are becoming more and more siloed with like-minded folks, and they're, you know, you're just the sounding board, right? Where you're communicating with people who already share a similar worldview. And a couple of years ago, I had this really great opportunity to see Bryan Stevenson speak. It was like before, you know, the movie was made, and it was really interesting. And he had this.
Who was that? You saw?
He gave this advice that was about, like, I worked in K through 12 education, underserved populations at the time, and he gave this advice about it's important to be proximate to the communities that you serve.
Yeah.
And to take that a step further, I think that
He's a good guy.
it's important to intentionally interact with people who share a different worldview than you, who are different than you, have different experiences and backgrounds than you, and hire and recruit people who think differently and are different than you. Because if we're not doing those things, I don't see a lot of change happening on the issues that we talked about. In history, well, different, like it will repeat itself in different forms. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around like the idea of being proximate and intentionally engaging with, with folks.
That is spot on. My first reference point for that idea of proximate, I'll start with Africana studies, right? And it's sort of, I'll use the metaphor of these.
Go and start working on dinner. Okay.
The metaphor of using these highways, building these highways, 1950s to out to the suburbs, right? And you have white flight and so forth. And so you have the development of these basically all white suburbs, but you still have the capacity because the government made it so by how it structured these highways to go from there, bypass every community left behind, usually filled up with Black and brown people, poor whites, middle class, liberals, so forth, white liberals, but and you can just go straight to your place of employment without having to get off at any of those exits, right? You don't have to see those communities. You don't have to see those people. And when you're done with work, you get right back in your car and you go back to the suburbs. And again, you can bypass all of them. South Africa is set up like that. I spent 5 years in South Africa. Same kind of thing. You can drive all over the place and never see Black townships and, by Western definitions, poverty and so forth. So in terms of Black studies, undergraduate studies is set up like that. As I said before, you're a first year student, second year, third year, fourth year. You're going to graduate with being exposed to Eurocentric forms of knowledge and teaching and scholarship without really knowing it, right? But Africana studies is optional. Like you might get off at that exit if you really want to, but you don't have to, right? So that same kind of proximate problem, right, is it's a real thing in terms of neighborhoods and so forth and who we see and who we don't see, but it's also there within the education system. So yeah, we have to be intentional, including institutions of higher education. We have to be institutional about saying, you're going to get off at this exit. You've got to. It's too late. We should have done this yesterday. You got to come and see, because my institution values Black intellectual thought, Black voices, Black perspectives. And we're going to show you that we do, because we constructed our city, so to speak, our system of roads and highways so that you have to bypass there and say, what's up? Say hi, learn. Okay. Thank you so much, Mike. Yeah. So I start there, but yeah, being intentional about, first of all, understanding how did we get separate in terms of actual social space. But even when we're right next to each other in the same room, how did we get psychologically separate so that there are certain things I won't say to you and there are certain things you won't say to me, but I'll show you that I love you by getting my hair straightened like yours or lightening my skin, or I'll show you I love you by darkening my skin at the beach, or all these strange symbolic ways of interacting because it's a substitute for we can't actually get along. So I don't know if that answers it. I think there's a lot more to say there, but yes, we have to understand that being separate is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, number one. Number two, it's unhealthy. Number three, it's based on inequality. And then number four, go on into some action and try to meet people, right? Who come from a group who it wasn't their fault that they ended up over there and their property isn't worth anything. and their healthcare isn't good, and their groceries cost more, right? And they're worse, and so forth. We have to be intentional about it.
There's the comment, Marcus, from Jitwan. Information has to move to impact. There are numerous historical writings that inform the interested about the Black experiences in America. The question becomes, what will be done with that information to affect much needed systematic change?
Right, I think this is key. And again, this is where Africana studies makes a difference in terms of, because Africana studies, if we know about it, it's based on African, most of it based on African philosophical and cultural values and perspectives. So it operates differently than Eurocentric kinds of knowledge, right? So for one thing, to generalize, if one of the distinguishing features of Eurocentric knowledge is that knowledge is that which we can apprehend through the five senses. You have to be able to see it, count it, observe it, feel it in order for it to be real, right? That's an appearances-based kind of knowledge, right? That's why we know it has this Eurocentric lineage, right? Whereas an African philosophical perspective, knowledge is those things, but knowledge is also legitimate when it's intuition, when it's emotion, when it's spirit, right? And all those things that Eurocentric knowledge invalidates, right? In a kind of institutionally racist manner, and keeps putting Africana studies into the shadows and margins of higher education and so forth. Again, Africana studies is a way to try to open up what it means to be knowledgeable, number one, and number two, what the purpose of knowledge is. Knowledge that does not lead to liberation, and knowledge that does not lead to bringing human beings together and bringing human beings together with the earth is not considered valid knowledge in Africana studies. I hope that's clear, right?
I think this is an amazing conversation, and I really appreciate your sharing your knowledge. And I think it highlights for me the very distinct differences between the system that enslaved, that Africans were brought to, and so the societies that Africans were captured from were based on totally different paradigms and structures than what they were brought to. And to remind us all that slaves were not captured, slaves were created when they hit these borders, but they captured architects and designers and people who were politicians and healers. They captured a large vast of people who had a innumerable, amazing talent, and they became slaves. And the system into which they were brought was not designed for them to ever elevate to their true selves. And that system is perpetuated to this day. And I think what is critical, what you mentioned in terms of the economy, that being a plantation economy, all the systems that were created were designed to support that. And we've not had a true revisiting of breaking down and dismantling those systems to kind of mirror the system that we are taught that we exist within today. And I'll say this, and this will be the last thing that I say, because I know I'm probably the only person that's been in this chat just typing away. But I think it's interesting when you talk about how people are connected to protecting their interest. Back then, we had the slave patrol that was designed to protect the slaves because they were property, and the length to which people would go to justify what they had to do to maintain that system of slavery. And we look at today now where we have a pandemic, and the length to which people will go to maintain a system overall that is putting people at risk in real terms of death. So we think about the business owners who are really struggling to keep their businesses open, but are not willing to make certain adjustments for a short term so that we can have long-term effects. And just the whole idea of property being so much more valuable than our human lives, I think that's something that is entrenched in American history, and it really has to be integrated in every conversation we have about race and about economics. But I really appreciate this conversation. It's been beneficial, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those incredibly insightful comments, and also the comments you've been writing as well. I appreciate that. You mentioned so many things. I'll pick up on one. In understanding that the people we're calling Black people, the people who we're calling African Americans, have a much longer history prior to being forcefully transported here than they do here, has got to be acknowledged, right? When we're talking about the Black difference in culture and behavior and mindset and what's important and what's valuable, right? That's not traceable to something that fell from the sky. It's certainly not traceable to the European cultures that have demonized and othered those kinds of things, right? That's traceable to a much longer heritage in Africa. We often think of that image of the slave ship packed with African naked bodies like sardines, and we're horrified by that. But what we don't often do is move from that image backward, right? We usually start there and then move forward to where we are now. And so all we can say is Black people and slavery and so forth. But before that, who were those people? What languages did they speak? What were their professions? What were they expert at? And, you know, some of those things were mentioned. The incredible bronze statues of the Benin Empire, that when Europeans got there, they couldn't believe the sophistication, the technological sophistication of what was going on there. The doggone wood carvings of West Africa, right, predate any kind of European conquest and enslavement. But the enormous empires that held together millions of people who were tolerant of different languages and religions, right? Those leaders, healers, right? It's important to start getting a sense of who were those enslaved people? What were their values? What did they do? What did they see? Right? That helps us make sense of certain things we see today. The more communal oriented nature of most Black communities and neighborhoods. The central importance of the spiritual world for most Black neighborhoods and people. Little things like don't split poles, right? This culture that comes, it's a culture of unity, right? Where it's believed that psychologically we're better together, stronger together. It's that kind of culture that would say, don't split poles, and so forth.
We had one more question, Marcus, from Helen. How can people be intentionally anti-racist in their places of employment, neighborhoods, families, and schools right now?
Right, that's that question I was asking of you, because I mean, I can speak about it in terms of where my profession, but I would need you to grasp some of the things that we've said here, some of the things I'm sure you already knew, or it comes to you very easily when you hear it. And how would that apply to your professions? So in mine, you know, I would say we have to ultimately re-understand what knowledge means and who has knowledge and whose knowledge is legitimate. And I would say straight up, a community knowledge should not be considered little brother knowledge to the college or universities. It should be validated as based on real world experience and understanding how to navigate challenges in life that many of us couldn't start to understand, right? Value that knowledge, take it in, bring it into the courses we teach, make our courses relevant. co-design courses with community folks, hold courses in community institutions, so on and so forth. So I have a sense of, that's just a little bit, but I have a sense of how to be intentionally anti-racist within my profession. But then my question would be, for those professions I don't know anything about, we listed them at the beginning, how would you start thinking through that? Did my beautiful mama have a question?
No, that was the question. I mean, I wasn't asking it so much of you, but for others, you know, people who are in education, people who are in the corporate world, people who are in the legal world. I mean, what, you know, once you're woke, what can you do? Because there are lots of policies and practices out there embedded, as you've been talking about, that each of us has, I think, an obligation, a responsibility to do something with in our own world. So, you know, I think if we think about being intentionally anti-racist, we have to look at ourselves first, our own worlds, our own jobs, our own families, and see what we can do to raise that consciousness, raise the awareness, so that we do become anti-racist. So we are anti-racist.
And as you ponder that for 2 seconds, let me just say, my gorgeous mother here and my handsome father were intentional in naming me, right? So my name is Marcus Du Bois Watson, right? Marcus for Marcus Garvey, Du Bois. I don't know what they were doing in the 60s, but and then Du Bois, you know, after W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So Black freedom fighters. So that's a way of being intentional.
I mean, I just, one of the ways I think that I try to be anti-racist is, Marcus, you know, I started a charter school here in Buffalo. And one of our design elements is to infuse the history and culture of African descended people throughout the year in all curricular areas. So it's not just in social studies, it's not just in English, it's in all curricular areas, and it's not just in February. You know, that's one thing that one person can do. And you know, each of us has the power to do something, and that's the only point. Is, you know, we're each in our own worlds. What can we do so that there are thousands of us, millions of us, who are doing something to really take advantage of this time that the Black Lives Matter movement, as the tipping point, is pushing forward.
So we've talked a lot about education. What about some of those other professions? Maybe you're already doing, you know, intentionally anti-racist things. So I want to hear about that too. We talked about chief diversity officer. We talked about the corporate world and so forth. So law. Any ideas? And I'm jotting them down. I'm going to take them with me too.
Well,
I'll say this, Marcus, and a take on what Ms. Kramer just said. I think that intentionality is also how we're raising our children. And one of the things, you know, that we're very intentional about, and that's why I've had my little 6-year-old sitting here listening and trying to talk to him. As he says, it's grown-up talk, some of what he's hearing, but I'm telling him in real terms what that means, right? What that means that in days before, his best friend Alex wouldn't be as important as him because Alex has black skin. And what that means is being very intentional about how we're raising our kids, and what that means for the next generation, because eventually we're gonna have to just get rid of this ignorance. And I think that's how we're gonna do it.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for doing that. And I think that starting right in the house, I think, is one thing. And when we're watching movies and TV, pointing out that blackness and darkness almost always represents the bad thing, right? And you know, in terms of the arch enemy, and you know, even if the actor is white, they tend to wear black. Just pointing out how it's right under our noses, right? How we keep perpetuating this black equals negative kind of ideology. Dr. Getz.
Got a question and then a comment. What's your email?
My email.
Yeah.
Let me write. Can you see the chat?
Yeah.
All right, let me write it in there. Feel free to reach out to me.
I will.
And everybody.
Watson.
It's Watson, MD.
Oh, you're a doctor now. Watson.
For those on the phone that might not see it, it's Watson, MD at buffalostate.edu. Watson, MD at buffalostate.edu.
Okay.
Brother Mark, who is the young one? What's his name?
This is Ezra. Ezra, you say hi to Marcus, Dr. Marcus?
Ezra? Hi. Hi, how are you doing? How old are you?
Ezra.
Ezra, how old are you?
Good. Make eye contact.
What's your favorite thing in school to learn?
How old are you?
Writing? Okay. I found the one.
Writing? Is that what you said?
Nice. My kids would have said gym. I'm impressed.
We've got a few people dropping off here, Marcus, just putting chats to say thank you so much and really appreciate it. Wonder if you have any final thoughts here, or anyone has any closing questions for Marcus?
I'll ask this question, Marcus. You think we're gonna see it in our lifetime? Are we gonna succeed in our lifetime? Is this something for our kids and our grandkids?
Yeah.
I hope we succeed. I mean, it depends on how hard we push. It depends on how hard we push. But if I had to put money on it, I would say it's something for our kids and grandkids. And it hurts me to say that. What do you think? What do you think, Mark?
I think I spent too much time around this country to think that we're going to be able to get rid of it in the next 40 years. I think it's unfortunately going to take longer. You know, I think about how far we all thought we had come when we saw Obama elected, and now what we watch in the reaction to that. I think there's just still a lot of racism out there, and there's a lot of ignorance. And you know, every time I hear this "all lives matter" or the pushback on some of these things, it makes me think that we'll be lucky if our kids see it in their lifetime. It hurts me to say that too.
Yeah.
What is it?
I think Mark is right.
Yeah, but I think it's a time we can push it though. Again, if we're intentional. If we're intentional about understanding the problem, especially from a proper perspective, if we're intentional about owning our complicity in it, if we're intentional about enduring the discomfort that we have to feel, you know, in changing things, I think that's the way to do it. And encourage people, if you would, if you have young people in your lives, take Africana Studies courses. This is the kind of thing they're getting out of it. And instead of us all talking to each other and we already agree with each other, we get new generations of people in larger numbers getting that perspective, getting that education, and they go out into the workforce, into their families, doing the kind of things that Mark is doing and that many of us do, I'm sure, which is, again, being intentional about, you know what, this is what being a realtor is supposed to be. We're not supposed to do this and this and this. This is what being a lawyer, you know, I only want to do law if I'm doing this. Speaking up, you know, when it comes to the healthcare field, my fellow nurses and doctors, why do you insult the Black patients? and the Muslim patients when they come in. I'm speaking from my wife's real experiences witnessing this. You know, but you don't do that with the white patients. So encouraging younger people you speak to, you know, in your networks, who you're influential with, about the importance of Africana studies as at least one very important tool to try to get to where we're trying to get to.
Well, Marcus, as you and Dr. Getz and Mark mentioned, it may be an unfortunate reality with the timing, but you are certainly doing your part, and we appreciate so much your passion, your expertise that you brought to the table, and let's all put our hands together, put them up for Marcus here tonight. We really appreciate it, and maybe we'll have you back, Marcus, to do another one, because we could go on a multiple area of topics. So we really appreciate it tonight.
Thank you guys all for coming, making the time. Your questions, your input. Thank you for what I know you do in your lives regarding these issues to push this forward. Thank you for your spirit. Stay healthy and strong. Okay, reach out to me. You see my email. Reach out to me if anytime you wish.
And as we said, we'll get the reading list from Marcus and any other materials that he wants to pass along. And to Marcus's point, we do have the auditing classes, and I'm not sure if the AAS, the Africana Studies classes, are options, but that is something that you could look at if you are interested in taking some of those courses. We do have the auditing program for alumni and friends of the retirees emeriti and friends of the college. So maybe something you want to look into.
Thank you.
Marcus, you want me to leave this on so you and Mark and Troy, the football guys, can catch up?
Sure. If they're willing.
I can leave it running if you want to chat longer.
Just for a quick minute. Yeah, just for a quick minute.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, I have to take my son somewhere, so I'm going to have to bop up. But I will leave this running, and you guys can have a chat. And anyone who wants to stay on. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll turn off the recording so you guys can, when you're telling your war story, sir.